Good morning. Thank you very much for the Central Asia Trade Forum for inviting the OECD to present on its recent work about tourism policy responses to the COVID-19 crisis. I will present you today the recent work we conducted to support policymakers in this recovery from the crisis. We produced a note with input from our member and partner countries, which looks at the current tourism outlook and what governments are doing. In this slide, you can see at a glance what the note, which is called Tourism for the Future, COVID-19 Policy Response and Recovery, looks at. So when we look at the status of the tourism sector, we can see that there is high uncertainty, and in OECD countries, it is estimated an 80% decrease in international tourism economy, an unprecedented crisis for the sector. Domestic tourism is driving the short-term recovery, but a real recovery will take place only when international travel will be able to resume. Our work looks at what governments have been doing, and we can see that impressive immediate government actions have been put in place to protect jobs and protect business and help them to survive during these difficult times. Countries are also putting in place measures to ensure the long-term recovery, combining short-term needs and longer-term objectives and strategies, including increased digitalization of the sector and the increased sustainability. Looking more in detail at the impact, the crisis has been unprecedented in scale, and the outlook looks extremely uncertain. The OECD estimates an 80% decrease in international tourism recovery in 2020, and no significant recovery is expected until 2021. These estimates were previously conducted by the OECD, and we had a range between 60 and 80%. And when we revised this in September, October, we now expect the downside scenario of previous estimates. The OECD also estimates that global GDP will fall by 4.5% in 2020, and as you're all aware, there has been exceptional decreases also in many subsectors of tourism, and a very evident one is aviation, where passenger traffic is expected to fall by 66% in 2020, and also in the accommodation sector. And STR, which is a data insight company, showed that in the first half of 2020, the revenues per available room were down by more than 60%. So the COVID-19 crisis has dramatically changed the tourism, governance, and policy context. As mentioned, the outlook looks extremely uncertain, and with the second phase of lockdown measures and restriction, the sector is likely to face stop and start cycles. The sector has benefited from many economic support from governments, but more needs to be done to protect the sector and to have targeted and efficient support. Key policy priorities that our members highlighted in this time are, first of all, restoring travel confidence and sustaining domestic tourism, support tourism businesses to adapt to the new context and to survive to this crisis, support a safe return of international tourism when this will be possible, provide clear information to tourists and business and limit uncertainty to the extent possible, and evolve the response measure that were started to be put in place last spring to address the existing gaps. The last point of key policy priorities is also a start to build towards a more resilient and sustainable tourism sector, because measures put in place today will shape the future of tourism of tomorrow. The crisis is having very tangible effects on the economic and on the society, and this is evident for places, people, and businesses. As we can see from the infographic on the slide, before the COVID-19 crisis, in OECD countries, GDP contributed on average 4.4% of GDP and almost 7% of employment. Very interesting, it also contributed to 21.5% of service exports. We can see from the infographic that domestic tourism is an important part of expenditure in OECD countries, domestic tourism represents 73/4 of the global spending. However, in the longer term, the recovery of domestic tourism is not sufficient to support the tourism economy. The impact of the crisis is felt for the entire tourism ecosystem. As you're well aware, tourism is a very fragmented sector and it spans across different areas. When we go to a place, we don't go just for a hotel, we go for visit the attraction, to eat the food, and so for having an efficient and sustainable recovery, the reopening of the tourism economy and rebuilding of destination will require a strong coordinated approach across policy areas. The recovery will vary from place to place, as the impact has been very different at a subnational level across destinations. We see the impacts are highly localized within countries. The map shows examples from Europe and the different vulnerability with a color code. In fact, regions where tourism is more intense and there is a higher share of jobs in the tourism sector and where seasonality is higher, it will be more impacted. As the impacts will vary, so will be the recovery responses, and the OECD, as part of its mandate, has been looking at the destination examples, which are leveraging the crisis to build a more sustainable tourism sector for the future. You can see, for examples of the slide, one is Corsica in France, which is implementing an ecotourism roadmap to rebuild tourism. Kyoto, Japan, the destination management organization, it's repositioning its recovery strategy to reorient it towards local needs. And the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand is leveraging the national funds provided by the government to support the recovery to accelerate the implementation of its destination sustainable strategy. In the next session, we will look at what governments beyond destination are doing at a national level to cushion the blow to tourism and to prepare for the recovery. We see three main policy areas, as in the slide. In fact, the crisis is a call for government to take strong and coordinated policy action. The three areas are a little bit also consequential in terms of timing. And the first one is mitigating the impact and supporting people and businesses, especially small and medium enterprises. And this includes protecting tourists by providing information, supporting jobs and workers, and supporting businesses in this difficult time. The second area of focus for policymakers is evolving support to manage the reopening of tourism beyond the initial measures that have been put in place, and this includes enhancing coordination also with the private sector, lifting travel restriction in a way that it's safe and is not counterproductive and does not backfire on the sector, help business to reactivate and reopen when possible, and restore travel confidence, which has been strongly hit. The third area of focus is preparing the recovery and shaping the futures of tomorrow. As mentioned, the measures that governments will put in place today will determine the future of the sector. So here we are talking about rethinking tourism, rethinking what is tourism success beyond number of arrivals, but also economic and social impacts and impact on the environment, rebuilding destinations in a sustainable way, and also restore innovation and investing in the sector, which will be fundamental to make it more resilient for the future. Looking more in detail in this three area of focus, the first one is supporting people, and we see that countries put in place for supporting jobs, cross-sectoral schemes, and tourism strongly benefited from this. And some countries also put in place specific tourism policies. And one example is Korea, who designated tourism as a special support sector for employment. And also in some countries, like in Italy, there was established sector-specific support and for specific category as well as seasonal workers. In Spain, there is an interesting example, so also producing guidelines with the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Health to support tourism workers in following the guidelines and be safe. As regards to supporting business and their survival, we can see different type of measures implemented. This range between direct financial support, grants, subsidies, ease to access finance, particularly for small and medium enterprises, or temporary relaxing lending obligation, or relaxing or suspending tax on social contribution. One example here is Portugal, who has dedicated 1.7 billion euros to support tourism business in accommodation sector, travel agencies, and restaurants. Looking at the second area of focus, which is evolving support, we can see four main categories of actions that countries are undertaking. The first one is promoting a coordinated action across government, for instance, establishing task forces, and Greece is an example where the Ministry of Tourism established a committee for crisis management. It's important also to involve the private sector in coordination efforts, as well as the different ministries and different level of governments. The second area here, it's supporting businesses reactivation and adaptation. Tourism business needed to cope with implementing new guidelines, new regulations, and one very interesting example is Austria, who is he's established a free testing program for tourism workers with 150 million euros dedicated fund, and so workers in the tourism sector can undergo regular testing for free. The third area is lifting travel restriction and restarting tourism activity. It's very important to have strong coordination in this effort and to ensure that travel restrictions are lifted only when it's safe to do so, to avoid a backfire on the sector. An example of initiative here is the travel bubble established between Australia and New Zealand. And the last area here is restoring travel confidence through the use of voucher and trying to stimulate demand again, especially domestic demand in the short term. And Japan, for instance, has a program, has a scheme which provides vouchers for Japanese tourists to travel around the country domestically. And this has been proved to be very successful to support hotels and various tourism businesses. Looking forward and looking ahead, looking more with a forward-looking approach, the crisis is also an opportunity to rethink tourism for the future. So countries need to reinforce coordination mechanism among government and with the private sector to better support tourism, SMEs, workers, and destination in their recovery. When putting in place recovery plans, countries need to take into consideration the impact beyond the crisis and remembering that measures put in place today will shape the future for tomorrow. Lastly, it's important to in this phase to encourage the digital, low carbon and structural transition needed to build a stronger, more sustainable and resilient tourism sector. We see some efforts countries are doing in this direction, and this is the example, for instance, in Mexico, that during the crisis established a new sustainable tourism strategy to 2030 to bring coordination among sustainable initiatives and to make sure there will be a radical change in the tourism sector after the crisis. And New Zealand also established the New Zealand Tourism Future Task Force, which advises on how tourism could change for a better future. So we started drawing a list of very initial lessons because it's very important to learn from the crisis on how to build a more resilient sector. And this is some initial lessons we draw based on what countries, based on country inputs and on research. And these are summarized in this slide. And so countries need to have integrated policy responses. It has been proved challenging sometimes to deliver efficient support, and the more targeted support is needed. It's important to limit uncertainty to the extent possible, to give clear information to tourists and business so that they can have better crisis responses and they can plan a little bit. It's important to include social, economic, environmental goals in recovery plans. And it's important to have very risk-based solution based on evidence and data when lifting travel restriction. As we saw during the crisis, there is a strong need also for timely and comparable data, more real time to support policymakers in taking decisions. And lastly, it's very important to leverage the crisis to tackle the structural issues that have been impacting the tourism sector even before the crisis. So here, I take this opportunity to show you where you can find our tourism paper with the information I have presented and with many more examples and much more analysis. We have an OECD coronavirus hub, and if you Google OECD tourism coronavirus, you will find our note, which has been recently updated. At the link here, you can also see more OECD publications, which might be useful, including OECD Tourism Trends and Policy 2020, where you can find a wide range of data and information on a country basis. Thank you very much for your attention.